Hey guys, it's Paul Myers, owner and lead therapist of Intentional Counseling. We're a group practice in Frisco, Texas. We're specializing in mental health. And today we're going to cover some risk factors for addiction. I get a lot of addiction clients. It's really common. It's becoming more and more common. So we're going to cover some risk factors that you're more prone to be addicted if you have any of these, and be good to be aware of. So I have some general risk factors written down. I'm going to go in depth under each one. So the first one here is usually age. So the younger you are, typically, the more prone to addiction you are. Because from age 0 to age 25, our brains are developing and growing. And the younger we are, the faster and the more development is occurring at that time. So your brain grows much faster during early childhood development as opposed to, maybe late adolescence or early adulthood where there's a lot less growth there, but we're still growing. So the earlier we are exposed to something addictive, maybe the younger we are, that means the more development your brain is undergoing at that time, which makes you more susceptible to getting addicted, right? Addiction at a young age actually rewires neurobiologically the pathways in your brain. It's very interesting. So age is a huge risk factor. Under the age of 25, we're way more prone to addiction than when we're older, when our brain's mostly already set in stone, per se. So that's a thing to be aware of, and to be, if you're a parent, be mindful of with your children, or if you are a child or adolescent, to be aware of, or young adult. Risk factor number 2 is the Diethesis. That's just a fancy clinical term to say you have a genetic predisposition to be more inclined to addiction. Some people's brains are going to produce more dopamine than others. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter responsible for pleasure in your brain. And if you have a higher Diethesis, that means your brain's going to produce more dopamine than another person. Lucky you. That's just genetic, right? But be aware of that. Some people do have that, right? Risk factor number 3 is hereditary. Some of the time our Diethesis comes from our family lineage, our hereditary backgrounds. If you have addiction in your family, a parent, a grandparent who had addiction were way more likely to have that hereditary disposition and that Diethesis. All of that kind of goes together. So be aware if your parents had addictive problems or addictions in their life. That sets you up to be more likely to have addiction. It doesn't guarantee it, but it's a risk factor, right? Okay. Number 4 risk factor is mental disorders that have high levels of impulsivity. So certain disorders are out there that a common symptom of that disorder is impulsivity or impulse control problems, meaning you're lacking a natural self-discipline, a natural self-control. That really puts you more prone to addiction because things that are addictive are very hard to say no to, and they're very hard to regulate. So if you have a natural impulsivity problem, it's just easy to just kind of indulge in the thing that's addictive and enjoyable anyways, right? Common disorders that have impulsivity would be like ADD, ADHD. It's very normal to be impulsive with that. You just kind of do without thinking. Bipolar disorders or mood disorders, particularly when you're manic or elevated, you're much more likely to be impulsive. Or certain personality disorders where you're more inclined for impulsivity as well. So another risk factor for addiction is misinformation. We live in an age of information, and there's a lot of information on the internet. I would say there's a lot more bad information than there is good information. I would argue that producing good information takes a lot more work and a lot more knowledge, a lot more experience, a lot more training, a lot more people, a lot more effort, versus bad information. Anybody can really produce that at any time, right? And so misinformation is a common one. I see a lot of people that come into my office and they have addictions and they have misinformation. if I, let's say, for example, I have an emotional dependency on THC or marijuana, and I've been using regularly for a while, and I use it to cope, and I have an emotional dependency on it, and I'll have some misinformation, because if you try really hard, you can go online and you can actually find information that supports how marijuana use is healthy or good for you or not problematic. So that'd be a good example of misinformation, where we talked about in previous videos how people with addiction tend to rationalize and justify their addiction away and minimize their addiction like it's really not a problem. And so we do see a lot of people with addiction putting misinformation online, and they're taking their justifications of their addiction and they're putting that online as facts or factual evidence that it's helping me, right? So that's an example of misinformation that, oh, well, this helps me and it makes me feel better. That's misinformation. That's classic justification and rationalization of substance abuse or unhealthy substance use. So there's a lot of that available that's very easy to find on the internet. If you look for it, you'll find a lot of it, right? Risk factor next is limited knowledge. That kind of goes with the misinformation, because with as much as there is bad information, we want to actually find good information. So good information a lot of good information comes from clinical studies, where there's lots of people that put a lot of effort into these types of studies, scholarly articles, educated people, highly specialized people that are really passionate about this subject. They've studied the physiological, neurobiological, emotional, and psychological effects of substances or addictive things to your brain and to your development. And there's a lot of information and training and knowledge and education on these topics. That's good information, right? Whether it's a boardroom of PhD psychiatrists and neurobiologists who have 20, 30 years of experience, and they all kind of got together and they came up with this resource or a book or clinical studies that really are involving quite a few people. Great information to be looking at, right? Also be paying attention to who the author is of the information that you're receiving. Who wrote that information? Is it a 16-year-old that has a marijuana or cocaine addiction that put the article out? If so, then they're probably rationalizing and justifying like all addicts do. And so that's not really good information. Versus if this is, this was written by 3 people, all PhDs or MDs, all with clinical training, all with background in addiction and neurobiology or medical science, with 15 to 30 years of experience each in the mental health field. That's good information, right? So be careful what type of information you trust. We have a lot of bad information, and there's very limited good information because it's just more difficult to produce. The last risk factor is cultural influences. Lots of cultures deem certain types of addiction acceptable, right? I know there's an alcohol culture where drinking is acceptable, drinking is encouraged, it's worshipped, it's valued, it's like a positive thing, right? It's seen as normal, right? Or whatever the addiction is, whatever that substance or addictive component is, whether it's sex or pornography or alcohol or substances or technology. All of that, we have cultural influences. Some cultural influences come from your family. If your family normalizes substance abuse or addictive things, it's no big deal. Really common addiction now is technology addiction because it's normal. And so we have a cultural influence of normal technology addiction, like, what's the big deal? Everybody has a device. Everybody uses their device. Everyone has a phone. Everyone has apps. Everyone has YouTube. Everyone has social media. Everyone plays video games. Everyone vapes. Everyone smokes weed. Everyone drinks. Everyone likes sex. We normalize addiction a lot culturally, and we make it acceptable, right? So a key component here is just because it feels good doesn't actually make it healthy or beneficial, right? And so, if you have cultural influences, maybe your family normalizes things that are addictive, or you have friends or peers that normalize it, or if it's maybe where you grew up, what country you grew up, or what state you grew up in, that normalizes it. Just because it's normal doesn't make it healthy or good, or just because it's legal doesn't mean that it's healthy or good for you, or just because it feels good doesn't mean that it's healthy or good for you. So keep in mind, if you have some of these risk factors, try to be vigilant and aware, and try to moderate things that are addictive in your life. Have rules for yourself, some parameters and some boundaries, because we're all susceptible to addiction. And that's very wise to do, to practice self-discipline, self-control, and to set up some parameters for yourself to just make it easier on yourself so you're not having to be strong 24/7, right? So that's all I have for you today. If you don't have a therapist, or if you've never tried counseling, I'd be more than happy to help you. I highly recommend it. It's just for people who want to grow and be better and want a safe place to improve and work on themselves. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave it below and we'd be happy to get back with you. Thanks for stopping by and hope this is helpful. Take care.